My dear child, a funeral was being planned for your destiny in the spirit realm, and heaven just cancelled it by voiding the death certificate before the signature that would have made it binding could touch the page. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about spiritual warfare in the general sense. This is about a specific document, a specific ceremony, a specific, organized, deliberately arranged ending that was being prepared for the future you have been privately grieving. The future whose death felt so real to you that you began attending the funeral without knowing you were the one who was supposed to be in the casket. The funeral is cancelled. The document is voided, and the destiny it was written for is alive. You have been living in funeral mode, not dramatically, not in crisis, in the specific, low-grade, going through the motions manner of a person who has internally accepted that the version of their life they once believed was possible has died somewhere along the way. The dreams that did not materialize, the doors that closed in sequence, the losses that accumulated until the accumulation produced the quiet, private, never-announced grief of a person mourning a future that feels already buried. My beloved child, the mourning was real, but the death was not. The grief you have been processing was attendance at a ceremony whose document was never signed, because the signature required to make a death certificate binding over your destiny was never in the hands of the one preparing the document. The document was prepared, the ceremony was organized, the pen moved toward the signature line, and at the exact moment the ink would have touched the page, a voice from heaven spoke a single word that voided everything the document contained. Stay here. What I reveal next is what was on the document and why the signature line was never available to the hand holding the pen. Type funeral cancelled if you have been living in low-grade funeral mode, mourning a future you believed died somewhere along the way, and God just told you a death certificate was being prepared for your destiny in the spirit realm, and heaven voided it before the signature could make it binding. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science. And thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct, click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The death certificate was not a vague spiritual threat. It was a detailed document listing the specific dreams, specific callings, and specific futures that were being declared dead by an authority that never had the legal standing to declare them. My beloved child, I need you to understand how a death certificate operates in the spirit realm. A death certificate requires 3 elements to become binding: a detailed description of what is being declared dead, a date of death, and an authorizing signature. The document that was being prepared for your destiny contained the first 2 elements. The details were filled in. The date was assigned. Everything except the signature was complete. The signature is what makes it binding. And the signature was never going to happen. My dear one, the details on the document were specific to your life, not a generic ending applied to a generic destiny. A precise, itemized, line-by-line declaration of death over the specific dreams you stopped pursuing, the specific callings you stopped expecting, the specific dimensions of your future that you began mourning, when the losses accumulated enough weight to convince your system that what was being mourned was genuinely dead. Each item on the document corresponded to a specific grief in your heart. The correspondence was not coincidental. The document was constructed by reading your grief, by observing which futures you stopped believing in, and listing those specific futures as deceased on a certificate whose authority the preparer did not possess. This message was not released for everyone who has experienced disappointment. This was aimed at the one person whose specific grief has been the evidence the enemy used to construct a death certificate, whose line items match the exact list of futures the viewer privately stopped expecting. The person who does not know the grief was being weaponized into a document whose legal force depended entirely on a signature that heaven's intervention just prevented from ever being applied. Type never signed if you just realized the death certificate listed the exact futures you stopped believing in, and the grief you were processing was being weaponized into a document whose legal force depended entirely on a signature that heaven voided before the ink could touch the page. I have been watching the funeral being planned since before you began attending it, and the watching is what activated the intervention that voided the document at the exact moment the pen was approaching the signature line, my dear one, not from a courtroom at a distance, from beside the document, standing at the table where the certificate was being prepared, reading every line item as it was written, registering every detail as it was filled in, watching the preparer construct a death declaration over futures that my hands were still actively building in a dimension the preparer could not access. I was at the table. The preparer did not see me, and the not seeing is what gave the preparer the confidence to bring the pen to the signature line. My beloved child, I watched you begin attending the funeral. The shift was not sudden. It was a gradual transition from hoping to grieving, a slow rotation of your internal posture from facing forward toward the future to facing downward toward a casket that contained a version of your life you had concluded was no longer breathing. I watched the rotation happen by degrees. Each degree corresponded to a specific loss. The first degree was the first major door that closed. The rotation was slight, barely perceptible. The second degree was the second loss. The third was the accumulation of unanswered prayers that your system was interpreting as confirmation that what was being prayed for was already dead. Each degree rotated your posture further from the forward-facing position and closer to the funeral attending position until the rotation was complete, and you were fully oriented toward a casket whose contents the death certificate was itemizing in real time. My child, I chose you for this message because the rotation just reached the degree where the funeral felt permanent, and permanent grief is the signature the document was waiting for. Type rotation stopped if God has been watching you rotate degree by degree from hope to grief, each loss turning your posture further toward a funeral whose document was being prepared in real time, and the intervention was activated at the exact degree where the grief was about to produce the permanence the death certificate needed as its authorizing signature. I know what it has been like to attend a funeral for your own future while still being expected to function as though the future is alive, my beloved child. The funeral mode did not announce itself as funeral mode. It arrived disguised as maturity, as the reasonable adjustment of expectations that a person makes when enough dreams have died that maintaining full expectation begins to feel irresponsible rather than faithful. The disguise was effective. You did not recognize the grief as funeral attendance. You recognized it as growing up, as the natural, inevitable. This is what adults learn transition from believing everything is possible to accepting that some things simply are not going to happen for you. The disguise made the funeral feel like wisdom, and wisdom does not get questioned. My child, I watched the disguise install itself over the grief with the precision of a costume that fits so well the wearer forgets they are wearing it. The maturity language covered the mourning experience. The acceptance framework covered the funeral attendance. And the person wearing the disguise began speaking about their diminished expectations with the calm, measured tone of someone who has made peace with a smaller life. When what was actually happening beneath the language was the grieving of a person who was standing over a casket without knowing the casket was open, and the body in it was the future they were supposed to be living. The calm was not peace. It was the specific, low-register, flatline calm of a person whose internal monitor had stopped expecting the heartbeat the monitor was designed to detect. The calm that arrives when the expectation of life is replaced by the acceptance of death. The calm that the death certificate was using as evidence that the declaration of death was accurate. You were not at peace with a smaller life. You were in mourning, and the mourning was dressed as wisdom so completely that you stopped recognizing the funeral as a funeral. The deepest wound the funeral mode produced was not the grief itself. It was the specific moment you began planning your life around the absence of what was in the casket, rather than expecting the casket to be empty. My dear child, there is a difference between mourning something dead and building around something dead. Mourning is temporary, the emotional processing of a loss whose weight is being carried through a season that will eventually complete. Building around is permanent, the architectural redesign of an entire life whose blueprints have been redrawn to accommodate the permanent absence of what was lost. You stopped mourning. You started building around. And the transition is when the funeral became permanent. My beloved child, I watched the blueprints change. The original blueprints, the ones drawn before the losses accumulated, contained rooms for the futures you once expected. Large rooms. Rooms whose dimensions were scaled to the size of the dreams they were designed to hold. The redesigned blueprints eliminated those rooms, not by tearing them out dramatically, by converting them, repurposing the space, filling what was designed for a specific dream with the generic functionality of a life that no longer expects the dream to arrive. The conversion felt productive. It felt like moving on. But moving on and building around look identical from the inside, and only the architect who drew the original blueprints knows the difference between a room repurposed and a room abandoned. The rooms were abandoned, not repurposed, and the abandonment was the strongest evidence the death certificate could cite on its list of items declared dead. Because abandoned rooms in the blueprint of a life are the architectural equivalent of a funeral's attendees accepting the death as final. My dear one, the rooms were never supposed to be abandoned. They were supposed to be waiting, and what they were waiting for is about to arrive. Type rooms still waiting if you redesigned your life's blueprint around the absence of futures you stopped expecting, converting the rooms that were built for specific dreams into generic space. And the architectural abandonment was the strongest evidence. The death certificate cited as proof the dreams were dead when the rooms were always supposed to be waiting for what is about to arrive. The funeral was never legitimate. It was a ceremony organized by an authority that did not possess the legal standing to declare dead what was still alive in the jurisdiction that actually governs the status of your destiny. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the experience of the funeral from the legitimacy of the funeral. The experience was real. The grief was genuine. The rotation from hope to mourning was felt at every degree by a body and a spirit that processed each loss as evidence that the future in the casket was genuinely deceased. The experience passed every test for authentic grief. But authentic grief directed at a living thing is not evidence that the thing is dead. It is evidence that the griever was deceived about the thing's status. My child, in the legal system that governs the status of a person's destiny, only one authority carries the jurisdiction to declare something dead. Not circumstances, not accumulated losses, not the enemy who prepared the document, not the grief of the person attending the funeral. Only the one who authored the destiny in the first place carries the legal standing to issue a death certificate over it. I authored your destiny, and I never authorized the document. The preparer constructed the certificate without jurisdictional authority. The details were filled in by reading your grief, rather than by consulting the author. The date of death was assigned based on the day you began attending the funeral, rather than on an actual termination of the destiny's vital signs. And the signature line, the only element that would have given the unauthorized document legal force, was approaching the hand of an entity whose pen carries no weight in the court that governs what lives and what dies in your life. My dear one, the document was voided not because it was challenged in court. It was voided because it was filed in a court that does not recognize the authority of the one who prepared it. The voided document is producing its first effects in your system right now. And the first effect is a disturbance in the funeral mode that has been governing your internal posture, because a voided death certificate sends a notification to every system that was operating on the assumption that the thing declared dead was actually dead, my beloved child. Something shifted inside you today, not a dramatic resurrection, a disturbance, the specific, low level. Something is not right about the grief disruption that occurs when the foundation the funeral was standing on. The assumption that the future in the casket was genuinely deceased receives a counter-signal from an authority whose jurisdiction exceeds the authority that organized the ceremony. The counter-signal says alive, and the funeral mode is processing alive for the first time. My dear one, I need you to understand what a voided death certificate does to the systems that were operating under its assumed authority. Every system in your life that adjusted to the declared death, the blueprint that was redesigned, the rooms that were converted, the expectations that were lowered, the internal monitor that flatlined. Every system received the death certificate's information as operating data and restructured its function accordingly. The voiding sends a correction to every system simultaneously, and the correction says the data you restructured around was filed by an unauthorized source, and the subject of the document is alive. I have been preparing this voiding behind every season of your funeral attendance. While you were grieving and redesigning and converting rooms and accepting the maturity-disguised mourning as your new operating posture, I was at the document, monitoring the pen's approach to the signature line, calculating the exact moment the intervention needed to occur, and preparing the single word of authority that would void the certificate before the ink could produce the binding force the document required. My child, the word was spoken. The document is void, and the disturbance you are feeling is the notification reaching every system that was functioning on dead data. Type a live signal if you felt a disturbance in the grief today, a disruption in the funeral mode that your system cannot explain, and you believe the disturbance is the voided death certificate sending the notification alive to every system that was operating on the assumption the future in the casket was genuinely deceased. Heaven just canceled the funeral that was being planned in the spirit realm for you, and the title carries that specific language because the cancellation was not a postponement or a pause, but a permanent termination of a ceremony whose every element has been dismantled by the voiding of the document it was organized around. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens to a funeral when its death certificate is voided. A funeral without a valid death certificate has no legal basis. The ceremony cannot proceed. The casket cannot be closed. The mourners cannot finalize their grief. And the body that was supposed to be in the casket can't be declared deceased, because the document that would have authorized the declaration was voided before the signature that would have given it. Authority was applied. No signature, no certificate, no funeral, no death. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific low-grade funeral mode your life has been operating in. The title says cancelled, not interrupted, not paused, cancelled. The distinction matters because a paused funeral can resume. A cancelled funeral cannot. The cancellation voided the document that was the ceremony's legal foundation, and a ceremony whose legal foundation has been voided does not have the structural basis to reconvene. The funeral cannot resume. The death cannot be redeclared. And the grief that was attending a ceremony that has been permanently cancelled is grief that just lost its venue. My child, the grief is still present, but the funeral is gone. And grief without a funeral is grief that will process itself to completion because the ceremony that was sustaining the grief by providing it a permanent venue has been dismantled. Grief that has a venue persists indefinitely. Grief that loses its venue completes its processing and resolves. The venue just closed, and the grief is beginning to process its own ending. The casket is being opened right now. My beloved child, and what is inside it is not dead, but has been breathing the entire time the funeral was being attended by a person whose grief convinced them to stop checking for a pulse they assumed would not be there. I need you to feel the proximity of what is about to be revealed, not the spiritual concept of something eventually being resurrected from a distant future. The present tense, casket lid lifting, contents being exposed, pulse still beating proximity of a future that was declared dead by an unauthorized document, and mourned by a person whose mourning was more convincing than the death ever was. The lid is lifting, and what is beneath it is breathing. My dear one, everything has been building toward this opening. The losses that rotated your posture toward the casket. The maturity disguise that made the funeral feel like wisdom. The blueprints that were redesigned around an absence the death certificate was using as evidence. The rooms that were converted. The monitor that flatlined. The pen that approached the signature line. The word that voided the document, the disturbance that sent the alive notification to every system. And now, the casket, opening, revealing contents whose vital signs have been active the entire duration of the funeral that was organized around their declared death. My child, the pulse was never absent. The monitor that flatlined was reading the grief's signal rather than the destiny signal. The monitor was calibrated to the wrong frequency, detecting the low-register calm of the funeral mode, rather than the deeper sub-funeral, beneath the grief heartbeat of a future whose life was never legally terminated, because the document that would have terminated it was voided before the signature could authorize the ending. The future has a pulse. The casket is opening, and what has been breathing beneath the lid is about to meet the eyes of the person who was mourning it. Type still breathing if you can feel the casket opening right now, and the future you declared dead and mourned and redesigned your life around has been carrying a pulse the entire time, because the death certificate was voided before the signature could terminate the vital signs of a destiny whose heartbeat was operating beneath the grief at a frequency the flatlined monitor could not detect. The casket is open, the future is alive, and the eyes of the person who was attending a funeral for something that was never legally dead are now looking at a destiny whose pulse has been beating beneath the grief for the entire duration of the ceremony that was just cancelled by the voiding of a document whose signature line was never available to the hand holding the pen. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment the mourner looks into the casket expecting to confirm the death, and instead encounters the undeniable, pulse-carrying, chest-rising, breathing evidence that what they were grieving is alive. The moment the funeral collapses, not under theological argument but under the weight of a living thing, occupying a casket that was supposed to hold something dead. The future is alive. Feel the pulse. Heaven just cancelled the funeral that was being planned in the spirit realm for you. The title is not a dramatic spiritual metaphor about general hope being restored. It is an operational report from the court that governs the jurisdiction over your destiny. A court that was presented with a death certificate, prepared by an unauthorized entity, reviewed the document, identified the absence of a valid signature, and voided the certificate with the single word of authority that cancelled every element of the ceremony the document was organizing. My child, the word was spoken at the exact moment the pen was approaching the signature line. Not a second before, not during the preparation of the document, at the moment of signing. Because the voiding of a document at the moment of attempted signing carries more legal force than the voiding of a document during its preparation. And the legal force of this voiding is what makes the cancellation permanent rather than provisional. The pen never touched the line. The ink never met the page. And the destiny whose death was being declared is standing in an open casket with a pulse that the funeral's entire ceremony could not stop. Now that the casket is open and the future is alive, and the funeral has been permanently cancelled, everything about the funeral mode that was governing your internal operating system is being dismantled by the evidence of a pulse the grief said was not there. My dear child, this is what happens when a mourner discovers the subject of their funeral is alive. The grief does not merely adjust. It encounters a category error so fundamental that the entire grief processing system must reboot. The system was built to process death. It is now encountering life, and a death processing system encountering life does not produce a gradual transition. It produces a shutdown, the specific, total, every morning function going offline shutdown of a system whose foundational operating assumption was just voided alongside the document. The funeral mode is shutting down, and the shutdown is the resurrection. My beloved child, the shutdown is producing cascading effects across every system that was restructured to accommodate the declared death. The blueprint is reverting. The rooms that were converted from dream-sized spaces into generic functionality are being unconverted. The walls returning to their original positions, the dimensions expanding back to the scale the original blueprint specified. The space reopening for the specific futures that were removed when the funeral mode convinced the architect to redesign around their absence. The rooms are reopening at their original dimensions. The internal monitor that flatlined is recalibrating. The frequency that was reading the grief's low register calm is being retuned to the deeper sub-grief frequency, where the destiny's pulse has been beating the entire time. And the first reading the recalibrated monitor produces will be the first heartbeat the system has registered since the funeral mode replaced the original monitoring frequency with the flatline. My child, the first heartbeat is about to register, and a system hearing a heartbeat it classified as dead produces the most powerful form of hope available. Resurrection hope. Type resurrection hope. If the funeral mode is shutting down and the systems that were restructured around the declared death are reverting their original design. Rooms reopening, blueprints reverting, the monitor recalibrating to the frequency where the pulse has been beating. And the first heartbeat the system registers is producing resurrection hope, the most powerful form of hope available to a person whose future was just declared alive. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the funeral is cancelled and the rooms are reopening, and the monitor is registering the heartbeat of a destiny. The grief convinced you had stopped breathing because a person whose future just came out of a casket moves through the world with a vitality the funeral attending version could never access. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the energy source. You have been running on funeral energy, the specific, low-grade, just enough to maintain basic function output that a person in mourning mode produces. Funeral energy sustains existence. It does not fuel expansion. It keeps the lights dim enough to navigate the rooms that remain, while the rooms that were converted stay dark. The fuel source just switched. From funeral to resurrection. My beloved child, resurrection energy is not the same as pre-funeral energy. It is not a return to the baseline you were operating at before the losses accumulated. It is a category above the baseline. The specific came back from declared death, voided the certificate, survived the ceremony energy that is only available to a person whose future was in a casket and came out of it alive. The mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the morning. The first conscious awareness of each day, registering the low-grade flatline of a system, attending a funeral that began before sunrise and continued through every waking hour. Tomorrow you wake, and the monitor is reading a heartbeat. The first conscious awareness of the day will carry the specific, startling, "My future is alive" signal that the recalibrated monitor is now producing. The rooms in the blueprint are reopening at their original dimensions. The specific dreams that were converted into generic space during the funeral mode are being restored to the size the original architect designed them at. Not compressed, not cautiously expanded, fully restored. Because the voided certificate carries the same authority as the original blueprint. And the original blueprint says, those rooms were always meant to be full-sized. People are going to notice the resurrection energy before you describe the cancellation. Because a person whose internal monitor just switched from flatline to heartbeat carries an atmospheric vitality that funeral mode functioning could never produce, regardless of how competently the mourner was, maintaining the appearance of a life still in progress. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the funeral season, who interacted with the mourning disguised as maturity version, who sensed the flatline energy without being able to identify what was producing the specific dim, something is not fully alive quality your presence was carrying. Those people are about to encounter the post-casket version. They will say, "You seem alive in a way I have not seen before." They will mean the heartbeat is back. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when their future comes out of a casket. Not the quality of someone whose future never faced a funeral. That quality is untested. The post-casket quality is different. It carries the specific, certified alive, voided document, survived the ceremony vitality of a person who attended their own future's funeral, and then watched the casket open, and the future stand up, and the grief lose its venue, and the monitor register heartbeat the flat line was concealing. Post-casket vitality attracts differently than untested vitality, because post-casket has been through the funeral and carries the authority of someone whose future survived what was organized to end it. Connections that require post-casket authority to form are approaching your newly vital frequency right now. There are assignments and divine partnerships whose prerequisite is the specific quality that only a person whose destiny was declared dead and then declared alive carries. The resilience level, funeral surviving, certificate voiding authority that untested people cannot produce. My dear one, what approaches the post-casket version of you is calibrated to the specific energy that only someone who has been to the funeral and come back alive can broadcast. Type post-casket if you believe the resurrection energy is producing a vitality that the funeral mode version could not generate, and connections requiring the specific authority of someone whose destiny survived a cancelled funeral are approaching a frequency that only a person who attended their own future ceremony and watched it be voided can carry. I need you to understand why I allowed the funeral to proceed as far as it did before voiding the document. Because the timing of the intervention reveals something about the specific strength I was developing in you that a pre-funeral voiding could never have produced, my beloved child. I could have voided the document during its preparation, before the details were filled in, before the date was assigned, before the pen was manufactured that would have carried the ink to the signature line. A pre-preparation voiding would have prevented the funeral from ever being organized, which would have prevented the grief from ever forming, which would have prevented you from ever rotating toward. The casket that contained a future you believed was dead. You would have been spared the funeral entirely, and the sparing would have cost you something the funeral gave. My child, a person who never attends a funeral for their own future does not develop the specific capacity that a person who attends the funeral and then watches the casket open carries. The capacity is post-funeral authority. The specific, I was at the ceremony and the ceremony was cancelled strength that operates at a level no unfuneraled person can access, because the level requires the experiential foundation of having mourned what was never dead and then receiving it back alive. The mourning developed the capacity. The receiving back activates it. My dear one, I chose you for the post-funeral assignment because the assignment requires someone who has carried the weight of a future they believed was dead without abandoning the building. The future was supposed to inhabit. You stayed in the building. You converted the rooms. You redesigned the blueprints. But you did not leave. And a person who stays in a building whose rooms are being mourned, rather than abandoning the structure entirely, is a person whose loyalty to the original design survives the funeral, the enemy, organized to convince them the design was deceased. You stayed in the building through the funeral, and staying is what qualified you. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most familiar evidence in its inventory, the accumulated losses themselves, and arguing that the losses were real deaths, and the death certificate was merely documenting what actually happened, rather than declaring something falsely. My child, it sounds like this. The dreams did die, the doors did close, the futures I was mourning did stop showing signs of life. The death certificate was not fabricated from nothing. It was constructed from actual losses whose cumulative weight was sufficient evidence that what was being declared dead had genuinely stopped functioning. The funeral was not premature. The funeral was the appropriate response to a body of evidence that any reasonable person would have interpreted as death. That doubt just used the reality of the losses as evidence for the legitimacy of the death certificate, and the argument collapses under one jurisdictional fact. My beloved child, losses are not deaths, and the distinction is the entire distance between a funeral that was warranted and a funeral that was voided. A loss is the cessation of function in one dimension. A death is the permanent termination of existence across all dimensions. And the entity that prepared the death certificate deliberately conflated the two, listing dimensional losses as total deaths on a document that required the conflation to produce enough line items to justify the ceremony. Your dreams did not die. They lost function in the visible dimension. And loss of function in one dimension, while the pulse continues in a deeper dimension, is not death. It is dormancy. And dormancy has an expiration that death does not. The dormancy is expiring right now. The pulse that was beating beneath the grief is surfacing. And what surfaces from dormancy carries the full vitality the pre-dormant version possessed, plus the specific, cannot be replicated, funeral surviving resilience the dormancy period produced. Type dormancy, not death, if the doubt just used the real losses as evidence for the death certificate. And you now understand that loss of function in the visible dimension is not the same as permanent termination across all dimensions. And what was declared dead was actually dormant. And dormancy has an expiration date that just arrived. During every day you attended the funeral, I was not at a distance watching the grief deepen from the position of a god whose intervention was pending. I was at the casket, my hand on the chest of your future, feeling the pulse that the flatline monitor was not detecting, because the monitor was reading the wrong frequency, my beloved child. You imagined a god who was unaware of the funeral, who was occupied elsewhere, while the ceremony was being organized, and the grief was deepening, and the blueprints were being redesigned, and the rooms were being converted, and the maturity disguise was settling over the mourning with a fit so complete, the mourner forgot they were wearing it. I was at the casket, my hand on the heartbeat the entire time. My child, a pulse felt by divine hands does not require a monitor to confirm it. The monitor that flatlined was a human frequency instrument reading human frequency data. The pulse was operating at a divine frequency, and divine frequency heartbeats do not register on human frequency monitors, which is why the flatline your system was displaying was accurate at the frequency the monitor was calibrated to, while being completely wrong at the frequency the pulse was actually beating on. The monitor was accurate, the reading was incomplete, and incomplete readings are the most dangerous kind, because they carry the credibility of accuracy while missing the data that would have changed the conclusion. There were nights during the funeral season when the grief was at its heaviest, when the mourning consumed the last available energy your system could spare from the daily functioning the funeral mode was sustaining. In those nights my hand pressed slightly harder on the chest in the casket, not to restart what had not stopped, to feel the pulse more intensely at the exact moment the mourner's system was most convinced the pulse was absent. My dear one, my hand was on the heartbeat while your grief was at the casket, both of us at the same location, for completely different reasons. I know the exact loss that rotated you the final degree toward the casket, the specific closed door that completed the rotation from partially grieving to fully attending, and that the death certificate listed as its primary evidence for the declaration. My dear one, not the first loss, not the most dramatic, the last one, the one whose weight was not necessarily the heaviest on its own, but whose arrival on top of the accumulated weight of every previous loss produced the specific tipping point. I am done expecting effect that converted you from a person who was mourning while still partially facing forward into a person who was fully oriented toward the casket. My beloved child, I know that loss by its exact coordinates in your timeline, and I know it because my hand was on the pulsant casket at the exact moment the final rotation completed, feeling the heartbeat remain steady while the person standing above the casket completed their turn toward it with the finality of a mourner who has concluded the death is permanent. The pulse did not change when you completed the rotation. The heartbeat did not respond to the finality of the grief by weakening or accelerating. It maintained the same steady divine frequency rhythm it had been maintaining since the first loss rotated the first degree. My child, the stability of the pulse during the moment of your deepest grief is the strongest evidence that the death was never real, because a pulse that does not respond to the mourner's complete acceptance of the death is a pulse operating on a frequency independent of the mourner's belief about its status. The pulse does not need you to believe in it to continue beating. It beats because the authority who authored the destiny never signed the certificate, and an unsigned certificate cannot stop a heartbeat. The God whose hand was on the pulse during your final rotation is the same God standing beside you now, confirming that the heartbeat never wavered, not once, through the entire funeral. Type never wavered if God just described the specific loss that completed your rotation toward the casket. And his hand on the pulse at that exact moment confirmed the heartbeat did not change. Because the pulse operates on a frequency independent of the mourner's belief about its status, and an unsigned certificate cannot stop what the author of the destiny never authorized to end. Now that the funeral is cancelled, and the casket is open, and the pulse has been confirmed, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the future that just came out of the casket is received by the person who was mourning it. Take off the mourning clothes. You are still wearing them, not externally, internally. The maturity disguise that covered the grief, the lowered expectations that fit the funeral mode, the redesigned blueprints that accommodated the declared death, the flatline posture that settled into the body of a person whose monitor was reading the wrong frequency. Each of these is a garment of mourning that was put on during the ceremony, and that has remained on because the person wearing them did not know the ceremony was cancelled until this message arrived. The ceremony is cancelled. The garments must come off. My child, a person who continues wearing mourning clothes after the funeral has been voided is a person whose external posture contradicts their internal reality. The internal reality says the future is alive. The external garments say the future is dead. And the contradiction between the two produces a specific friction that prevents the resurrected future from fully integrating into the life of the person, whose systems are still dressed for a ceremony that no longer exists. Remove the lowered expectations. They were tilted for a funeral. Remove the redesigned blueprints. They were drawn for a death. Remove the maturity-disguised grief. It was the formal wear of a ceremony that has been permanently cancelled. When the old garments are removed, do not replace them with cautious versions of the same garments. Do not put on slightly less funeral clothing as a hedged response to the resurrection. Put on the original clothes, the pre-funeral expectations, the original blueprints, the full-sized rooms, the forward-facing posture the rotation replaced with the casket-facing orientation, original clothes, for the original future that is alive. You made it to the open casket, my beloved child, and I need you to stand beside it long enough to feel what it means to see a future you mourned as dead looking back at you with a pulse that never stopped beating. Feel the pulse, not through the flatlined monitor that was reading the wrong frequency, through your own hand, placed on the chest of a future that was declared dead by an unauthorized document, mourned by a person whose grief was weaponized into evidence for a ceremony that was organized to make the death feel permanent. The chest is rising, the heartbeat is steady, and the steady beat is the sound of something that survived a funeral it was never supposed to be the subject of. The future is alive, and alive sounds like a heartbeat. I want to thank you for something the funeral mode made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for staying in the building. Thank you for not abandoning the structure whose rooms were being converted and whose blueprints were being redesigned around a death the ceremony was declaring permanent. Thank you for the converted rooms, because conversion is not demolition. You did not tear the rooms down. You repurposed them. And repurposed rooms can be unconverted. Demolished rooms cannot. My dear child, the unconversion is possible because you stayed. The rooms can reopen to their original dimensions because you did not destroy the walls when the grief told you the space would never be needed again. The walls held. The structure survived the funeral. And the structure surviving is the reason the resurrected future has a building to return to. Let the tears come, not funeral tears, not mourning tears, not the tears of a person attending a ceremony for something they believed was permanently gone. Resurrection tears, the tears of a person standing at an open casket, watching their future breathe for the first time since the grief convinced them the breathing had stopped. Type future breathing if tears are forming right now, because you are standing beside an open casket, watching a future you mourned as dead breathing with a pulse that never stopped. And the tears are not grief but resurrection, because the ceremony was cancelled, the document was voided, and what was declared dead by an unauthorized hand is alive under the authority of the only hand whose signature determines what lives and what dies in your life. You are not the person attending a funeral for their own future anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one who rotated degree by degree from hope to mourning, the one who dressed the grief in the disguise of maturity, so completely the mourning felt like wisdom, the one who redesigned their blueprints around a casket whose contents were declared dead by a document whose signature line was never available to the hand holding the pen, the one whose internal monitor flatlined on the wrong frequency, while the divine frequency pulse was beating steadily beneath the grief the entire time. That identity was permanently retired the moment the casket opened and the future stood up, and the voided certificate fell to the floor of a cancelled ceremony whose every element has been dismantled by the single word of authority spoken at the exact moment the ink was approaching the page. You are the person whose future is alive now, and alive does not attend funerals. The funeral mode that governed your energy, your expectations, your blueprints, your room dimensions, your internal monitor, and your private belief about what was still possible for your life has been permanently cancelled by a voiding whose legal force exceeds the assumed authority of every entity that organized the ceremony the voiding dismantled. My dear child, the ceremony is over, but not in the way funerals are over, in the way cancelled things are over, meaning the ceremony did not complete its purpose. It was interrupted before the signature could authorize the ending. And an interrupted ceremony whose document was voided carries no residual authority over the life it was organized to declare finished. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God voids unauthorized death certificates, not a person whose future is dying, a person whose future survived a funeral organized by an entity whose pen carries no weight in the jurisdiction that governs whether the things written on the certificate live or die. Your future is alive, the pulse is confirmed, the casket is empty, and the person who was standing at a ceremony, dressed in mourning clothes for a future the enemy declared dead, is now standing in the ruins of a cancelled funeral, wearing the original clothes of the original expectations that the original blueprints specified for the original rooms that were always designed to hold the original dreams. At the original dimensions, the architect drew Bu for first. Loss rotated the first degree. The rooms are reopening. The blueprints are reverting. The monitor is reading the heartbeat. The mourning clothes are removed. And the future that was in the casket is not in the casket anymore. It is walking beside the person it belongs to with the specific post-funeral voided certificate, survived the ceremony vitality that only a destiny whose death was declared and cancelled carries. Walk forward with a living future, my beloved child. The funeral is behind you. The death was never real. The document was never signed. And the God who spoke the word that voided the certificate at the moment of attempted signing is the same God walking beside you now, confirming with every step that what the enemy planned as a permanent ending has become the most powerful evidence of a life that was never legally available to be ended. Subscribe to this channel so that every time heaven cancels a ceremony that was being planned against your destiny, the announcement reaches you before the funeral mode convinces you to keep attending. You are not someone who mourns a dead future anymore. You are someone whose God voided the death certificate before the ink could touch the page. The next message carries the first vital signs report from a future that just came out of a casket. And what the pulse reveals about the strength of a destiny that survived a funeral will prove that what was declared dead was always alive, and what the enemy was planning was never going to receive the signature it required. Type Destiny Alive if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the funeral was unauthorized, the death certificate was voided. The grief was attendance at a cancelled ceremony. The pulse never stopped, the rooms are reopening, the blueprints are reverting. And the God who spoke the single word that cancelled every element of the funeral is the same God confirming that the future the enemy tried to bury is not only alive, but carrying the post-funeral authority that only a destiny that survived its own ceremony can possess.